A racist professor tries to sabotage a black student because he does not think the black student belongs in his class. 19 years later, the professor is shocked to see the black man walk into his office. Mark sat stiffly in the worn chair, the smell of old books and chalk dust surrounding him. He stared at the paper in front of him, the bold red F glaring from the top right corner. His heart raced, but his face remained calm. Across the desk, Professor Smith leaned back in his chair, his eyes cool and assessing. "You know, Mark," Smith began, his tone casual but sharp. "Some people just don't have what it takes to succeed in this field." Mark didn't flinch. He'd heard the professor's subtle jabs all semester, but this felt different. Smith's eyes weren't just assessing his academic performance. They were stripping him down, sizing up who Mark was, who he was supposed to be. "You think that just because you got into this university, you belong here?" Smith's voice was now more pointed. He leaned forward, his lips curling into a thin smile. "Let me give you some advice. Not everyone is meant to be a scholar, especially, well, someone like you." There it was. No more hiding behind vague criticism or veiled comments. Mark felt the heat rise in his chest, but he refused to let it show. He wasn't going to give Smith the satisfaction of seeing him crack. "I've put in the work, Professor," Mark said, keeping his voice steady. "I belong here just as much as anyone else." Smith's smile widened, as if he found Mark's response amusing. "Do you really believe that?" He picked up the exam paper and waved it in the air. "Because this says otherwise. This says you're wasting your time, and quite frankly, mine." Mark clenched his fists under the desk, fighting to stay composed. Smith's words echoed every stereotype he had fought against his entire life. Mark had grown used to working twice as hard to prove himself, but nothing had prepared him for this kind of blatant disrespect, especially from someone who held power over his academic future. "You should reconsider your options, Mark. There's no shame in admitting when something isn't for you," Smith continued, his tone now dripping with false concern. "There are plenty of fields that would suit you better, perhaps something more practical." Mark stared at him, the implication clear. "People like you don't belong in these spaces, not here, not in economics, not in places where power and influence are made." "I'm not quitting," Mark said firmly, each word feeling like a small victory in itself. Smith leaned back in his chair again, his condescending smile fading. "That's your choice, but don't say I didn't warn you. You'll never amount to anything in this field." Mark rose slowly from the chair, gripping his failed exam in one hand. He met Smith's gaze, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "I guess we'll see about that," Mark said, voice low but firm. He turned and walked out of the office, leaving the stifling air behind him. As Mark stepped into the hallway, the cool air hit his face, but the fire inside him burned hotter. He wasn't going to let Smith's words define him. 19 years later, Mark Reed walked across the familiar stone pathways of Northview University, the cool fall breeze ruffling his suit jacket. The campus looked almost exactly the same as it had when he was a student. Tall, ivy-covered buildings, the sprawling quad filled with students, and the towering library that once felt like a fortress. But Mark felt different, more grounded, more sure of himself. He glanced up at the economics department building, the same place where years ago he had walked out of Professor Smith's office feeling small, angry, and humiliated. Now, he was walking back into that same building as the new Dean of Academic Affairs, a position he had worked tirelessly to earn. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Full circle," he muttered under his breath as he reached for the door. Inside, the familiar scent of old books and polished wood greeted him. He walked past the faculty offices, remembering how out of place he had once felt in these halls. Now the students looked at him with respect, some even nodding in acknowledgement as they recognized him from the campus announcements. He didn't linger on their gazes. His thoughts were elsewhere. Memories of that day in Smith's office came rushing back. The words, the tone, the cold dismissal, it all lingered in his mind, even now. The feeling of being told he didn't belong had never left him, even as he stood here, in a position that proved Smith wrong. Mark reached his office, a large room with tall windows overlooking the quad, a far cry from the cramped student offices he once visited. But he didn't care much for the decor. He placed his briefcase on the desk and looked out the window. watching the students move between classes. They were the reason he had taken this job. It wasn't about proving himself anymore. He had done that. It was about making sure no one else had to go through what he had endured. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," Mark said, turning around. The door opened and a young woman stepped in. She was about 20, with short black hair and a backpack slung over one shoulder. She wore the determined expression of someone who had learned early on how to navigate difficult spaces. "Dean Reed?" she asked, stepping forward hesitantly. "That's me," Mark said with a smile. "You must be Tasha Miller, economics major, right?" Tasha nodded, stepping into the room. "Yeah, I've heard a lot about you. Congratulations on the new position." "Thanks," Mark said, motioning for her to take a seat. "What can I do for you?" Tasha sat down, her eyes scanning the office briefly before she focused on Mark. "I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm in Professor Smith's class and, well, I've been struggling." Mark raised an eyebrow, instantly aware of the direction this conversation was going. "Struggling how?" Tasha sighed, leaning forward. "It's not the work, I know the material, but it's like, no matter what I do, I'm not good enough. He treats me differently from the other students. I've noticed it with a few others too, mostly black students. It's like he's waiting for us to fail." Mark felt a familiar knot form in his stomach, the same knot he'd felt years ago sitting in front of Smith. Hearing those same insidious remarks, he leaned back in his chair, keeping his expression calm, though inside he was boiling. "I know what you're talking about," Mark said quietly. "I had him when I was a student." Tasha's eyes widened. "You did?" "Yeah, and it wasn't any different back then." Mark leaned forward slightly. "Listen, Tasha, it's not about your abilities. I know it feels personal because it is, but that doesn't mean you don't belong here." Tasha looked at him for a moment, processing his words. "So what do I do? How do I deal with this?" Mark thought for a second, remembering how he had handled it, by pushing harder, fighting for every grade, every opportunity. But he knew that wasn't the answer now. He had the power to change things, to protect students like Tasha from going through the same fight alone. "You focus on your work and you let me handle the rest," Mark said firmly. "If there's an issue, you come to me. I'll make sure things don't go the way they did before." Tasha nodded, relief and determination flickering in her eyes. "Thanks, Dean Reed. I don't want to feel like I have to prove myself all the time." "You shouldn't have to," Mark said, standing up as Tasha did the same. "And you won't, not while I'm here." As Tasha left the office, Mark sat back down, staring at the door. The campus might have looked the same, but he knew better than anyone that the system needed changing. And now, for the first time, he had the power to make that change. He wasn't going to let anyone else walk out of these halls feeling like they didn't belong. "Not this time," Mark whispered to himself, feeling the weight of his role settle in. Mark walked through the halls of the economics department, the sound of students' footsteps and quiet conversations filling the air. As he neared Professor Smith's office, he slowed his pace. The memories of his time as a student in these very halls weighed heavily on him. But now, as dean, his purpose was different. He was here to protect students like Tasha, to ensure they didn't face the same struggles he had. Just as he was about to pass Smith's office, a familiar voice floated into the hallway. Mark stopped. "That's not good enough." Smith's voice cut through the quiet murmur of students, sharp and dismissive. Mark took a step closer, staying just out of sight but within earshot. "I worked hard on this," came a voice Mark instantly recognized. It was Tasha. There was a mix of frustration and restraint in her tone, the same mix Mark had once tried to manage himself. "You're still missing the point," Smith said flatly. "I told you before, some students just aren't suited for this field." Mark felt his chest tighten, the words too familiar, too close to what had once been said to him. "I don't understand," Tasha said, her voice now tinged with exasperation. "I've been getting B's and A's in your class. What am I missing?" There was a pause, and then Smith's tone shifted, cold and patronizing. "Grades aren't everything, Miss Miller. You might do well enough on paper, but that doesn't mean you have what it takes to succeed in this profession. Maybe you should start considering other options, something less demanding." Mark's hands clenched at his sides. The exact same rhetoric, the same dismissive cruelty that had been thrown at him, was now being used against Tasha. It wasn't about her work, her grades, or her potential. It was about who she was, what she represented to Smith, someone who didn't fit into his narrow, biased view of who belonged in academia. "I'm doing the same work as everyone else," Tasha said, her voice quieter now but still holding firm. "Why do I feel like I'm being singled out?" "Singled out?" Smith's laugh was dry, almost mocking. "Don't be dramatic. I treat all my students the same. Some can handle the pressure and others, well, some don't quite measure up." Mark couldn't take it anymore. He stepped forward and rapped his knuckles against the half-open door. "Is there a problem here?" Mark asked, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. Smith's head snapped up, his expression shifting from smug to surprised in an instant. He quickly masked it, but Mark saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Dean Reed," Smith said, forcing a tight smile. No problem. Miss Miller and I were just discussing her performance in my class." Tasha turned, clearly relieved to see Mark, but still visibly shaken. Mark stepped inside, his eyes locking onto Smith. "Is that so?" Mark asked, his tone neutral but firm. He glanced at Tasha, who stood uncertainly between them. "Tasha, why don't you head back to your dorm for now? We'll talk later." Tasha hesitated for a moment, looking between Mark and Smith, then nodded. "Thank you, Dean Reed," she said softly, before gathering her things and stepping out of the office. The room was quiet for a moment after she left. Mark could feel Smith's eyes on him, sizing him up the way he always did. But Mark wasn't a student anymore. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation," Mark said, his gaze steady on Smith. Smith cleared his throat, his posture stiffening. "I don't know what you think you heard, Dean Reed, but I assure you, I was simply providing Miss Miller with feedback on her performance." Mark leaned against the doorframe, his face calm, though every part of him wanted to confront Smith with the same fire he'd felt years ago. But that wasn't his way anymore. He knew better. "Funny," Mark said slowly. "I seem to remember you giving me that same kind of feedback when I was a student." Smith blinked, his expression faltering for a split second before he recovered. "I treat all my students equally. If they can't handle the rigor of the program, that's not my fault." Mark stepped further into the room, his tone calm but cutting. "I think we both know that's not what this is about. It wasn't about my abilities back then, and it's not about Tasha's now. This is about something else, something we're not going to tolerate anymore." Smith's face flushed, but he tried to maintain his composure. "I've been teaching here for over 30 years, Dean Reed. I know what works and what doesn't. I'm not about to coddle students who can't keep up." Mark's voice dropped, his words measured but unyielding. "And that's why you're still here, Richard. You've been hiding behind tenure, thinking you can get away with treating certain students like Tasha, like me, like they don't belong. That ends now." Smith opened his mouth to respond, but Mark cut him off before he could get a word out. "I'm not the student who sat in this office years ago. I'm the dean now, and my responsibility is to ensure every student is treated fairly, not based on your biases, but based on their actual abilities. If you can't do that, we're going to have a problem." Smith's face twisted in frustration, but he didn't argue further. Mark didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked out of the office, his heart pounding, but his mind clear. The system was slow to change, but Mark was determined to make sure it did. The morning air in the economics department felt heavier than usual. Mark could feel the tension building since his last encounter with Smith. The unspoken understanding that this moment had been coming for years lingered between them. But now, it was no longer just about Mark. It was about Tasha and every other student who had been crushed under the weight of Smith's subtle, corrosive racism. Mark stood outside Smith's office, his heart steady but his mind sharp. He had dealt with men like Smith his whole life, people who thrived in power because they'd never been truly challenged. That was about to change. He rapped twice on the door, but this time he didn't wait for an invitation to enter. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. Smith sat behind his cluttered desk, stacks of papers and books forming a fortress around him. He glanced up, surprise flickering in his eyes for a moment, before he quickly masked it with his usual cool demeanor. "Dean Reed," Smith said, leaning back in his chair, trying to maintain control of the situation. "What brings you here this morning?" Mark closed the door behind him, not bothering to sit. He stood tall, his presence filling the small office. Smith may have been in his comfort zone, but Mark wasn't here to play by his rules. "We need to talk," Mark said, his voice calm but firm, "about your behavior toward Tasha Miller and other students like her." Smith raised an eyebrow, feigning ignorance. "I don't know what you're talking about. I treat all my students equally. If Miss Miller is struggling, that's on her, not me." Mark felt the familiar anger rise inside him, but he kept it in check. He wasn't going to give Smith the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. "No," Mark said, his voice level. "This isn't about grades or performance. This is about how you've consistently targeted certain students of color, and made it clear they don't belong in your class. I heard what you said to Tasha. I've heard it before from you." Smith stiffened, his face growing redder, but he kept his tone measured. "I don't know where you're getting this idea, Dean Reed, but I've been teaching here for decades. I know what it takes to succeed in this field, and I won't lower my standards to accommodate students who can't keep up." Mark took a step forward, his eyes locking onto Smith's. "This isn't about lowering standards, and you know it. It's about your biases. You've been telling black students for years that they don't have what it takes, that they're not good enough. You told me the same thing when I was a student." Smith scoffed, shaking his head. "You're exaggerating. I didn't target you. If anything, my feedback must have helped. Look at you now. You're the dean." Mark's fists clenched at his sides, but he kept his voice steady. "No, Smith, I didn't succeed because of you. I succeeded in spite of you. I worked twice as hard, pushed through your constant attempts to undermine me, and I made it here on my own." Smith smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Well then, I must have been doing something right if you made it this far." Mark's jaw tightened. He knew that men like Smith believed they were untouchable, protected by their tenure and years of service. But Mark wasn't here to let him get away with it anymore. "You're wrong," Mark said, his voice low but unwavering. "You've done nothing but hold students like Tasha back. You've used your position to maintain a system that keeps people like her out of the spaces they deserve to be in." Smith's smile faded, and his expression grew colder. "Dean Reed, I don't appreciate being accused of something as serious as discrimination. You can't just walk into my office and make baseless accusations." Mark stepped even closer, his voice sharpening. "These aren't baseless accusations. I have spoken with several students who've experienced the same treatment from you. It's a pattern, Smith, and I'm not going to stand by and let it continue." Smith shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but his pride kept him from backing down. "You can't fire me, Mark. I'm tenured, and you know as well as I do that it's not easy to get rid of a professor who's been here as long as I have." Mark stared him down, not blinking. "You're right. Firing you won't be easy, but I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to protect the students at this university. I'm not that kid you humiliated in your office all those years ago. I have the power to hold you accountable now." Smith opened his mouth to respond, but Mark cut him off. "And trust me," Mark continued, his voice firm and resolute, "I will hold you accountable. I've already gathered enough evidence to make a case against you. This ends now." Smith's face paled, the smugness draining from his expression. He seemed to realize for the first time that Mark wasn't bluffing. The weight of his own actions began to settle on him. Mark turned and walked toward the door, his back straight, his steps purposeful. He paused before leaving and glanced back at Smith, his voice quieter but no less powerful. "You had your chance to change, Richard. Now it's out of your hands." With that, Mark left the office, the door clicking softly behind him. The tension in his chest eased slightly as he walked down the hall, knowing he had finally confronted the man who had tried to break him so many years ago. But this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about students like Tasha and every other student who had been told they didn't belong. Mark wasn't just going to confront the problem, he was going to fix it. And Smith wouldn't be able to stop him. Mark sat at his desk, a file folder open in front of him. Inside were statements from students, detailed accounts of their experiences with Smith. He had spent the last week speaking to current and former students, many of whom had the same story. Comments about their abilities, their place in the field, their worth, all subtle enough to slip through the cracks, but persistent enough to leave a mark. Smith's pattern wasn't just clear, It was undeniable. Mark had been careful, methodical. He knew that getting rid of a tenured professor wasn't simple, and he couldn't afford any missteps. Smith had been at Northview for decades, building alliances and weaving himself into the fabric of the institution. But Mark was no longer the student at the mercy of a professor's whims. He was in a position of power now, and with that came the responsibility to act, not just for himself, but for everyone who had suffered under Smith's authority. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he had come to know well over the past few weeks. Dr. Lee's office. A voice answered. "Hi, it's Mark Reed. I'd like to schedule a meeting with Dr. Lee. It's urgent." After a few moments, the assistant confirmed a meeting later that day. Mark hung up and leaned back in his chair, staring out of his office window. The campus stretched before him, quiet and seemingly peaceful. But he knew better than most that beneath that surface there were fractures, deep ones that needed repairing. When the time came, Mark made his way to Dr. Amanda Lee's office, his steps steady. Dr. Lee, the university president, had been supportive of his initiative since he became dean, but he knew this would be a difficult conversation. Taking action against a tenured professor, especially one as established as Smith, was a big move, one that could create ripples across the institution. He knocked on her door, and her assistant ushered him in. Dr. Lee looked up from her desk, her eyes curious but cautious. "Mark, come in. What's on your mind?" Mark closed the door behind him and sat down across from her, placing the file folder on the desk between them. "I've been conducting some inquiries into Professor Smith's conduct with his students, and I've uncovered some serious issues." Dr. Lee's brows furrowed slightly as she leaned forward. "What kind of issues?" Mark opened the folder, pulling out a few of the statements. Over the years, Smith has consistently targeted Black students, undermining their confidence and subtly discouraging them from pursuing their studies. It's not just one or two cases. It's a pattern. Dr. Lee picked up one of the statements, skimming through it. Her face remained composed, but Mark could see the concern growing in her eyes. "He's been at Northview for over 30 years, she said slowly. "If what you're saying is true, this will be a major issue. Are you sure we have enough to move forward?" Mark nodded, his tone steady. "I've spoken to several students, both current and former. Some of them have been willing to come forward with formal complaints. I know that taking action against a tenured professor is difficult, but we can't let this continue. We have a responsibility to protect our students." Dr. Lee set the papers down, folding her hands on the desk. "This isn't the first time I've heard complaints about Smith," she admitted, her voice quieter now, "but no one has ever brought enough evidence to act on it." Mark felt a surge of frustration, though he kept it hidden. The system had been protecting Smith for years, allowing him to continue his behavior unchecked. But now, Mark was determined to make sure there was no more hiding. "I know it won't be easy," Mark said, "but we can't let that stop us. I became dean to make this institution better, and that means holding people like Smith accountable, no matter how long they've been here." Dr. Lee sighed, leaning back in her chair. "You're right, we can't ignore this, not anymore." She glanced at the file again, then met Mark's gaze. "But we need to tread carefully. This kind of move will stir up a lot of resistance, both from faculty and alumni. Firing a tenured professor isn't something the board will take lightly." Mark nodded. He had expected resistance, but that didn't change the need for action. "I'm ready for that. We need to show that we're serious about making this university a place where every student is treated fairly." Dr. Lee was silent for a moment, considering his words. Then she nodded, her expression resolute. "All right, I'll bring this to the board, but I'll need more than just these statements. We'll need to build a solid case if we're going to get their approval." Mark stood up, feeling a sense of relief and determination. "I'll get whatever you need." "Thank you for listening, Amanda." Dr. Lee gave him a small, tight smile. "I'll support you in this, Mark, but be prepared. This is going to be a fight." Mark walked out of the office, feeling the weight of what was to come. But he wasn't afraid of the fight. Not anymore. He had spent too many years being told what he couldn't do, where he didn't belong. Now, he had the power to change things, and he wasn't going to waste it. As he walked back to his office, Mark's phone buzzed with a message from Tasha. "Thanks again, Dean Reed. I don't know what I would have done without you." Mark smiled to himself as he typed a quick response. "You're welcome. We're just getting started." He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for students like Tasha, and for every student who had been told they didn't belong, he was ready to see it through. This wasn't just about Smith anymore. It was about the future of the university and the students who would walk these halls after him. And Mark was determined to make sure they walked those halls with their heads held high. The tension in the air was palpable. Mark could feel it the moment he stepped into the faculty lounge. Conversations halted mid-sentence as professors turned to look at him, their faces a mix of curiosity, unease, and outright hostility. The news had spread fast. Mark Reed, the new dean, was going after Professor Richard Smith, one of the university's most tenured and well-connected professors. It was the kind of move that rattled people, that made them question their own place in the institution. Mark had anticipated this. He had prepared himself for the backlash, but standing in the thick of it was another matter. As he walked across the room, a few faculty members quickly exchanged whispers. Some turned their backs, others watched him openly. He ignored them all, making his way toward the conference room where the meeting with the faculty board was about to begin. Inside the room, Dr. Amanda Lee sat at the head of the table, her face composed but serious. A few other senior professors were already seated, shuffling papers and murmuring amongst themselves. At the far end of the table sat Smith, his face flushed, eyes cold, as he watched Mark enter. Smith's usual smug demeanor had vanished, replaced by something much darker. Anger and fear masked under indignation. Mark took his seat, his eyes meeting Smith's for a brief moment before he turned his attention to Dr. Lee. "We're here to discuss the allegations brought against Professor Smith," Dr. Lee began, her voice steady but carrying the weight of the situation. "These are serious claims, and we've gathered to review the evidence and hear from both parties before making a recommendation to the board." Smith scoffed, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is absurd," he muttered under his breath, though it was clear he wanted to be heard. Mark remained silent, letting the room settle. He knew Smith would try to downplay everything, to make this seem like some personal vendetta, but Mark wasn't going to let him control the narrative. Dr. Lee glanced at Smith, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Professor Smith, you'll have a chance to speak. But first, we'll hear from Dean Reed, who has brought these allegations forward." Mark stood, feeling the eyes of everyone in the room on him. He opened the file he had brought with him, pulling out the statements from the students who had come forward. He knew this was his moment to make sure their voices were heard. "I've spent the last few weeks speaking with students, past and present, who have been in Professor Smith's classes." Mark began, his voice steady but firm. Many of them, particularly students of color, have reported a consistent pattern of discriminatory behavior. These students were made to feel as though they didn't belong in the program, as though their abilities and hard work were never enough. Smith's face grew redder, but Mark didn't stop. He read aloud a few of the students' statements, their words filling the room. "I've had multiple students tell me that they were encouraged to change their majors, despite receiving high grades in their coursework. Others were belittled, their contributions dismissed in class discussions. And this isn't new. Professor Smith has been doing this for years." At this, Smith couldn't stay silent any longer. He slammed his hand down on the table, his face twisted with anger. "This is nonsense," he spat. "You're taking the word of a few disgruntled students and turning it into some kind of witch hunt. I've dedicated my life to this university. I have high standards, and I won't apologize for that. If some students can't handle the rigor, that's not my fault." Mark stayed calm, though his pulse quickened. He wasn't going to let Smith turn this into a debate about standards. "This isn't about rigor, Smith," Mark said, his voice sharp. "It's about the way you've used your position to hold students back based on your own biases. You can claim it's about standards, but when the students who are consistently singled out are black, there's a pattern." Smith stood up now, his face flushed with rage. "I treat all my students the same," he shouted. "I don't see race. I don't care what color they are. If they can't meet the expectations of the course, that's on them, not me." The room fell silent as Smith's words hung in the air. Mark could feel the weight of them, How easily people like Smith dismissed race. How quickly they brushed aside the very real struggles of students of color. Dr. Lee cleared her throat, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Smith. "You'll get a chance to respond, Richard. But for now, let Dean Reed finish." Mark took a breath, calming himself before he continued. He wasn't going to let Smith's outburst rattle him. He wasn't that young student anymore, desperate to prove his worth. He was in control now. "The evidence speaks for itself," Mark said, his voice quieter now, but no less firm. "This isn't about one or two students. It's about years of discriminatory behavior. And it's not just me saying this. There are students willing to come forward to share their experiences. This is about more than just your so-called standards. It's about the environment you've created, one that tells certain students they don't belong simply because of who they are." Smith was shaking with anger now, his voice rising again. "You're trying to destroy my career over this, over baseless accusations. I've worked here longer than you've been alive, Reed. Who do you think you are, coming in here and trying to take me down?" Mark locked eyes with Smith, his own voice steady, calm. "I'm the Dean of Academic Affairs, and it's my job to protect the students at this university. If you can't see that what you've done is wrong, then you don't belong here." For a moment, the room was silent again. Mark could feel the tension building, the weight of everything that had been said hanging in the air. Smith was visibly shaking, his face a mix of fury and disbelief. Dr. Lee finally spoke, breaking the silence. "This is a serious matter, Richard. We will review the evidence carefully, but you should understand that these accusations are not baseless. We have a duty to ensure that all students are treated fairly and equitably." Smith slumped back into his chair, his face pale now. He had lost control of the room, and he knew it. Mark didn't wait for further argument. He gathered his papers and stood up, ready to leave. He had said what needed to be said, and now the decision was in the hands of the board. But he knew deep down that this was only the beginning. As he walked out of the room, he felt a sense of clarity, a resolve that had solidified within him. He had done what needed to be done, not just for himself, but for every student who had been made to feel small, who had been told they didn't belong. Smith's time at Northview was coming to an end. Mark had made sure of that. The sun was setting over Northview University as Mark Reed walked across the quad, the orange and pink hues casting long shadows over the campus. The board had finally made their decision earlier that afternoon. It was done. Professor Smith had been officially dismissed from his position. It hadn't been easy, but the weight of the evidence and the growing number of voices from students had made it impossible for the board to ignore the truth any longer. The decision had sent waves through the faculty. Some had stood by Smith, claiming it was a travesty to let go of a professor with decades of service. Others, though, had quietly voiced their support for Mark, recognizing the change that was long overdue. As Mark walked through the campus, he could feel the shift. Things were beginning to change. He made his way toward his office, his mind reflecting on everything that had brought him to this point. The confrontation with Smith, the meetings with students like Tasha, the weeks of gathering evidence, it had all built to this moment. Mark had done what he set out to do. He had protected his students, but more than that, he had helped dismantle a piece of the institution that had held people like him back for far too long. As Mark approached the steps to his building, he saw Tasha Miller waiting near the entrance. She spotted him and smiled, her expression one of relief and gratitude. "Dean Reed," Tasha said as he walked up. "I heard about Smith. He's really gone?" Mark nodded, a small smile crossing his face. "He's gone. The board made it official this afternoon." Tasha let out a breath, her shoulders relaxing as if a weight had been lifted. "I can't believe it. I mean, I knew you were working on it, but it feels like something that would never actually happen, you know?" "I know," Mark said, his voice soft. "I spent years thinking the same thing. But sometimes it just takes the right moment, the right people willing to stand up and say, 'Enough.'" Tasha nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and admiration. "Thank you, Dean Reed, for everything. I don't know what I would have done without you." Mark shook his head, his smile growing warmer. "You would have kept fighting, just like you've been doing all along. This wasn't just me, Tasha. You and the other students. You were the ones who made this happen. Tasha looked down, a small shy smile playing at the corners of her lips. Still, it means a lot knowing someone in your position has our backs. I've never had that before. Mark felt a pang of recognition. He knew exactly what that felt like. Being alone, feeling like no one was there to stand with you, to believe in you. That's why he had taken this job in the first place. I'm not going anywhere, Mark said firmly. And neither are you. You belong here, Tasha. Don't ever forget that. Tasha looked up at him, her eyes bright with determination. I won't, she said quietly, but with a confidence that hadn't been there before. They stood in silence for a moment, the air between them calm, but filled with understanding. Mark could see a piece of his younger self in her, the same fire that had driven him all those years ago. But he also saw something more. He saw the future, the generation that would follow him. The students who would rise to break down the walls that had been standing for far too long. Things are going to change here, Mark said, more to himself than to Tasha. It'll take time, but they will, Tasha nodded. Looking out over the campus, the sun now low on the horizon. It already feels different, she said quietly. Like we actually have a chance now, Mark smiled again. That's the point you do. Tasha glanced back at him, her smile now fully confident. I better get back. I've got a paper due tomorrow. Mark chuckled. Don't let me keep you from it. She laughed softly and gave him a quick wave before heading off toward the dorms. Mark watched her go, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction, not just in what he had accomplished, but in knowing that this was only the beginning. There were more students like Tasha, students who had been overlooked, dismissed, and discouraged. But now, they had someone in their corner, and Mark would make sure they never had to face the same obstacles alone again. He turned back toward his office, the halls now quiet as the evening settled in. As he reached his desk, Mark paused for a moment, looking around at the space that had once felt foreign to him. Now it felt like a place of possibility. He sat down, leaning back in his chair and taking a deep breath. The battle with Smith was over, but the work was far from done. There were still changes to be made, still voices to uplift, still students to protect. But for the first time in a long time, Mark felt a sense of peace, a knowing that things were moving in the right direction. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the last of its light over the campus, Mark looked out the window, a quiet resolve settling in his chest. The era of silence and complicity was over, a new era was beginning, and Mark was ready to lead it. The students of Northview University would walk these halls with their heads held high, and Mark would make sure of it.